Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series hosted by the Graduate School of Business and Leadership. First things, some Zoom protocols. So our special keynote guest will present his talk for about 45 minutes. And then remember, please, that any questions that you as participants may have, we request that you please use the Q&A button to send these questions through, and these will be addressed after the presentation. So the aim of our Graduate School in Business in Leadership webinar series is to empower postgraduate students, alumni, and business partners with information that will enable them to navigate the unprecedented challenges presented by COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected the workforce and livelihoods across the globe. Today, I am delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Dawie Rood, who is a founding member, director, and chief economist of the Efficient Group and is currently the chairperson of Efficient Private Clients, a subsidiary of the Efficient Group. Dawie was an economist at the South African Reserve Bank, and he specializes in monetary and fiscal policy. He is also an expert on the economic consequences that crypto assets could have. Dawie is actively involved in managing clients' asset portfolios. Today, the theme of our webinar is the fiscal budget hovering on the edge. And I'm sure that without any further ado, we very anxiously await for the talk on Dawie, which is, of course, now over to you. The virtual stage is all yours. Thank you very much, Dawie. Over to you.
Good morning to you, Professor. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. It's a privilege to be here this morning. I just want to get my screen up and running in presentation mode. That's it. It should work now. I just want to make sure you can see me, Professor. Is everything fine?
Yes, I can see well. Thank you.
And you can hear me fine. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Everybody seems to be experts on Zoom, and I must tell you, in a way, I'm quite excited about this new world in which we found ourselves. And I think there are a couple of trends that were well established before the lockdown, and we're seeing some of these trends are simply being accelerated. But of course, this talk this morning is about the budget of the Minister of Finance, and no budget happens in isolation. Budgets are also part, and we have to understand the context where things come from. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget. I've been working on the fiscal budgets literally for decades. I've been analyzing this. I've been part of the process of preparing budgets in the past. So I've seen many budgets come and go, and I can tell you that we are in very deep trouble in South Africa. We've never been where we are today, if you look at the fiscal account. So let me get going, and I call this hovering on the edge. And the first slide that I would like to share with you is this specific slide, because I think this slide really summarizes everything. And this slide, there are two lines here. The one is fiscal spending, state spending as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of the economy, and that's the red line. The dotted line, by the way, are estimates going forward, but the red line is this total state spending. And something interesting, if you look at state spending going back to 1964, for instance, state spending today well in excess of 30%, which simply means that the state in relative terms basically doubled in size since, well, the last 60 years or so. If you look at the other line, the blue line, is state revenue. Those are the various taxes mostly. And the various taxes, as with state spending, has been going up. And it's been going up because of tax increases, but also because the state requires more money. And the recent years, one can see that the state revenue is actually flattened out as a percentage of GDP. And the reason for that has to do, various reasons. One reason is people are aggressively structuring their tax affairs because people are, in many cases, are evading taxes or trying to lower their tax burden as much as they can. And I guess there's an argument to be made saying that we've reached the top of the so-called Laffer curve. A third point that I want to make, if I look at this specific graph, and there's a gap between the red one and the blue one. And that basically is the fiscal deficit. That is the amount of money that the state needs to borrow in order to be able to fund that huge and rising state spending number. So that is just the first graph that I would like to share with you. The second graph I would like to share with you is this one, and that is state debt as a percentage of GDP. Again, look at the dotted line, the red line, and after that are estimates of the Minister of Finance, which I do not necessarily share. In fact, I believe that state debt as a percentage of GDP will keep on going up at a faster rate than what the Minister of Finance is showing to us now. What I want to share with this as clearly is that the state debt levels currently around about 80% of GDP, actually a little bit higher, is quite high. And this is the problem that we have. State debt has become unsustainable. The rate of increase is totally unsustainable. And this number, this state debt relative to GDP, excludes the state-owned enterprises. That's in state-owned enterprises like Eskom, South African Airways, and the like. All right, before I get to the actual budget, I just want to talk a little bit about some major trends that I've witnessed recently and that we're all witnessing. And I think what we're doing at the moment with Zoom, for instance, is an example of that. That's an example of some of the recent trends that we've witnessed internationally. And I'm very, very excited about things that are happening. It is important for us as a country to make sure that we are properly positioned to be part of this new, wonderful, modern economy. And I'm afraid if one look at, for example, if one looks at the quality of our, especially our primary education, I'm very concerned about South Africa and how we are, whether we will be able to be part of this new modern economy. But things like, for example, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and the interesting thing about technology, people are, whenever there's a new technology, everybody's quite excited about that. And everybody's predicting that this is going to take over the world. But the thing about new technology, it always takes longer to take hold. But the moment it starts taking hold, it happens much quicker than what people think. And I think Bitcoin is a very good example of that. I prefer to call it private currencies, and I can spend days talking about these private currencies, but I'm very excited about that. Not about Bitcoin or the private currencies as such, but the underlying technology. Work from home, that's a new thing. I think the social dynamic, everything is going to change. It will have an impact on all sort of things, on people's well-being. Certain people will be able to participate in this work from home economy. Some people are less well-positioned to do that. So-called economy, that's also important. And what I mean by that, I've got a suspicion that the underlying economy of the world is actually larger than what we think, because many economic activities, like, for example, the act of Googling, is not included in economic data. So it's quite possible that the world economy and the South African economy could be bigger than what we think. And maybe there's a Nobel Prize out there waiting for a clever young economist to win. And then other things like certain biological advances like genetic engineering. Those are some of the major trends that I think is going to change the world in which we are living in. Before I get to the budget again, let's just understand what's going on in the international, the world economy in terms of politics and in terms of economics. There is a massive stimulation coming from the Americans. Biden is planning to spend an additional $1.9 trillion in the United States. The total stimulation, fiscal stimulation, additional stimulation in the US is in excess of 10% of the economy. So and it's not only the US, many other countries or blocks of countries are doing exactly the same. The Europeans, the Chinese, all of them are spending money like there's no tomorrow. Monetary policy, that is what central banks are doing, internationally are exceptionally accommodative. Interest rates are very, very low internationally. They are printing money, literally making money out of nothing. They give it fancy names like quantitative easing, for example, or yield curve control. So the monetary policy is very accommodative internationally. The financial markets are doing very well. I just had to look at the markets this morning. The markets are up and running again, which is good for us. And I think financial markets will continue with this fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. Financial markets are likely to keep on doing well, at least in the short term. There are some inflation fears. We could talk about that, and that's another debate. But it is possible that we may be entering a new phase of higher inflation. Not yet, but perhaps within a couple of months or a couple of years, inflation may come back again. And the political environment internationally has certainly improved quite substantially after the Biden win in the United States. And I'm not taking sides here, but the reality is that, well, Donald Trump there was some tension. Let's put it there. All right. Before I get to the budget again, let's just understand some of the political environment in which we found ourselves in South Africa. And the political environment is that we all know that there's a lot of infighting within the ANC. Now, I guess you can cut and slice and dice it in many different ways, but basically there are two groupings within the ANC. Let's call it the Cyril Ramaphosa grouping, which include himself, of course, and Pravin Gordhan and some other senior politicians, and the other groupings, let's call it the Ace Magashule grouping. So those are the two typical groupings that everybody is referring to within the ANC. There are many other groupings as well, and one grouping, if you like, is that of Tito Mboweni, the Minister of Finance, which quite often finds himself quite alone. He sometimes, the president even would reprimand him in public. He's a bit of a maverick, the Minister of Finance. I think he's perhaps the best that the ANC has to offer at the moment as the Minister of Finance because of his background as the governor of the South African Reserve Bank. But we have to understand that there is a lot of tension within the ANC, and there's a lot of tension within the tripartite alliance. And that is, one can actually see this very clearly looking at the comments of Kusatu, for example, after the budget of the Minister of Finance. What I also liked specifically about the speech of Minister Tito Mboweni yesterday is his reference to the Constitution. He sounded quite presidential, actually. That is something I'm very concerned about. But recently we've heard some comments, some senior politicians referring, well, to the judiciary, to certain judges, to the Constitution, and it's certainly not with the necessary respect to these institutions. I'm very concerned about that, but yesterday Tito Mboweni sounded quite presidential, protecting or defending our constitutions. We need that. We need that much more, and we need the president to really come out as well and say much stronger language that we are a constitutional democracy and we all have to play according to the rules. We also have to understand that the fiscal accounting today are in very deep trouble. I'm going to go through those accounts. And it's in very deep trouble, primarily because of many, many years of mismanagement. The ANC government is primarily responsible for the mess in which we are in. We all know about the corruption and incompetence and mismanagement that we see just about every day in the newspaper. So we are in very deep trouble. And unfortunately, much of this is still there. Certainly much improved from, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, but the improvement is far too slow. And we are in very deep trouble because of previous mismanagement of the fiscal accounts, and I'm going to go through that as well. I did mention that Tito Mboweni seems to be a lone voice in the wilderness sometimes, and I wonder how much pressure he's going to keep on taking, because he's taking a lot of pressure, and I will not be surprised if he decides to jump and go back to his farm in Magogoskloof and keep on cooking, for example. The financial markets do like him, and it would be unfortunate if he's not our Minister of Finance anymore. But without a doubt, sometimes I think he feels quite isolated. And also what has happened, what I witness, is that the real big decisions when it comes to the budget, those big decisions have moved to the presidency and to Pravin Gordhan to an extent. The Minister of Finance has always been a very senior minister in the budget or in cabinet. He still is that, but it seems to me as if Tito Mboweni particularly has been undermined to an extent the last couple of months, or perhaps a little bit longer. All right. Before I get to the budget again, let me give you just a short background on what's going on in the South African economy. Here are some of those macroeconomic aggregates that I'm going to have a look at. And let me go through without going through this, let me show you a couple of graphs. This is what I have here, is the inflation rate. What I expect in terms of inflation, that's the red one, and the blue line is simply the repo rate, what can be expected in terms of the repo rate over the next couple of months or so. And I expect the repo rate to be maintained at a relatively low level for quite some time. It's even possible that the governor at the South African Reserve Bank, and let me just make a comment about Lesetja Kganyago, I think he's doing an excellent job. But it is possible that interest rates can be lowered even further, especially with the rand doing not too badly recently. But the main point here certainly is that inflation, or that the interest rates are low and likely to remain relatively low for an extended period of time. In fact, we are probably going to follow the international trends, and international interest rates are very low. This is just a graph that I've manipulated a little bit. I'm trying to figure out if inflation is going to become a problem in South Africa or not. And I've got the money supply, that is the red one, the change in money supply. And you need money for inflation to become a problem. And you need the pool of money to increase. Now, that is not really happening in South Africa. So that's one reason to be not too concerned about inflation going forward. And as you can see, money supply growth currently in South Africa is actually quite muted, perhaps too low. And that's one reason to think that inflation is not going to be a problem in the short term. Eventually, I believe inflation is going to become a problem in South Africa. A question about the exchange rate of the currency, the rand. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. If there are questions afterwards, I will address this. But this is a graph, a calculation that I've done. The blue line, the rand is always undervalued. And the blue horizontal line, that dotted line, is the average undervaluation of the currency over time. And I use a certain purchasing power parity calculation here. So what I'm trying to do here is to see, just look at history and see where the rand is. It's always undervalued, but is it a lot undervalued or only a little bit undervalued or relatively overvalued? And at the moment, the rand is slightly below the blue horizontal line, telling me that the rand is a little bit on the strong side based on its historic trends. So it's important for an asset manager. I'm an asset manager, and at these sort of levels, I certainly will advise my clients, if you want to make an international investment, that these sort of levels are perhaps not too bad a level to take some of your money out of the country. This is the balance of payments. I'm again not going to go into much detail here, but essentially what it tells us is that we are exporting more than what we are importing at the moment. This is resulting in an inflow of capital into South Africa. Some of the reasons has to do with the commodity prices cycle at the moment, which certainly favors South Africa. But there are some other factors supporting the currency as well, and that is simple capital inflows. And those are some of the reasons why the rand are doing quite well. There's a bit of a sting in the tail in this specific graph, because part of the reason why we're running a surplus at the moment has to do with the fact that we've got very, very weak local demand. And local demand also is the reason why we're not importing that much. So although we can be happy about the current account surplus at the moment, part of the reason simply is because the local economy is very weak. This is our gross savings in South Africa as a percentage of GDP. Savings is usually between, say, 15 and perhaps 20% of GDP. This is important because that is the pool of savings available to the South African economy. And currently, the fiscal deficit is running about roughly more or less at the same levels, telling us that the state, the huge fiscal deficit, is basically taking up all the available savings in South Africa, making us very dependent on foreign capital inflows to fund investments in South Africa. This is the fiscal deficit. Oh no, this is the state's DISSAVING. Now, what I've done here, remember the fiscal deficit this year will be roughly about 700 billion rand. When I talk about this year, I mean the current financial year, which will end the end of March now, next month. So the current total fiscal deficit is in the region of about 700 billion rand. The Minister of Finance is going to spend roughly about 300 billion rand of that on capital expenditure. So it's okay, we all know, if you borrow money to buy a new house, that's okay. But it's a wrong idea to go and borrow money to go on holiday. And this is exactly what the Minister of Finance is doing. He's borrowing long-term money to spend on short-term current expenditure, and in the process, he's destroying capital, and the amount of money that's destroyed by the state is roughly about 300 or 400 billion rand annually, and that is what this graph basically tells us. This is unemployment in South Africa, a huge and massive problem in South Africa. The reason for high levels of unemployment, there are many, many reasons. The most important reason has to do with a very weak economic growth. Let me say something controversial. I think we have to implement policies not to improve employment. I don't believe employment is the problem in South Africa, or unemployment for that matter. I believe the lack of economic growth is the issue. So don't try to employ people. What we need to do, we have to put measures in place to grow the economy, and employment will look after itself. So I think the emphasis on unemployment is wrong. The emphasis must be on economic growth, and unemployment will fall in the process. This is just a graph showing economic growth. The Minister of Finance expects economic growth for last year, 2020, to be about 7.2%. I think it's a little bit on the optimistic side. I think that's minus 7.2%. I think it's probably going to be minus 8% or even slightly worse. Coming years, in the current year, 2021, economic growth can easily go to about 3% or so, but that's because of statistical noise, because of the very low base in 2020. But thereafter, I'm afraid economic growth is going to slow down again for many reasons. The lack of electricity is only but one. I can just point out that the economists argue whether are we in a recession or not. We're not in a recession, people. We are in a very deep depression. The South African economy has never, in the history of South Africa, gone through this kind of correction. In fact, at the height of the Great Depression in the United States, unemployment was standing at 25%. We have an unemployment of more than nearly 10% higher than that. And that's the narrow definition of unemployment. Okay, that's just a bit of a background on the South African economy. So let me get to the budget itself, and we can chat a little bit about the budget itself. I'm going to start off with the revenue, and that's the blue line, the graph that I showed you earlier. The blue line is state revenue as a percentage of GDP, basically consisting of the various taxes, and that has been going up in the recent years. And let's just have a look at where the bulk of state revenue comes from. Now, the bulk of state revenue comes from personal income taxes. That's more than 500 billion rand. That's nearly 40% of the total tax stake of the Minister of Finance comes from personal income taxes. The second most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance is a value-added tax, and value-added tax is an indirect tax. It's a tax that's a regressive tax. It's a broad-based tax, and economists usually favor an indirect tax, like, for example, VAT, for various reasons. Unfortunately, VAT is a regressive tax, which means that the poorer people, relatively speaking, paying a larger chunk of that specific tax. But remember, you can't look at one tax in isolation. You have to look at the total tax stake, the total tax regime. And if you look at the total tax regime in South Africa, then South Africa's tax regime is exceptionally progressive. And I'm going to show you some numbers just now. The third most important tax is company taxes, corporate taxes, contributing about 16% the total tax stake of the Minister of Finance. And it's perhaps important to make a comment about company taxes. Companies do not pay tax, not in South Africa or anywhere in the world. Companies always shift their total tax burden down to individuals, either to their customers or to their shareholders or to their employees, but companies don't pay tax. And the Minister of Finance did mention he would like to reduce the company tax, currently 28% to 27% in 2 or 3 years' time or so, which is a good thing. In fact, we in South Africa should try to lower our company tax to 0 if possible. So the companies do not pay taxes. And then a couple of smaller taxes. One tax that I would like to mention is the fuel levy, that's 6% over there. And the fuel levy is also an indirect tax. And if I was the Minister of Finance, I would have increased the fuel levy even by more. Here are some increases announced by the Minister of Finance. First of all, there was an adjustment on the fiscal or the personal income taxes. Remember, there's something called fiscal drag, which means that if your salary goes up to compensate for inflation, you quite often will land up or end up in a higher tax bracket. And the Minister of Finance tried to adjust for that. And the total cost to the fiscus is around about 2 billion rand, which is actually small change in the bigger picture. But there was a bit of an adjustment on the fiscal or on personal income tax brackets, not by much. So basically nothing happened on personal income taxes. I must just warn, there's a good possibility that we may in future see an increase, a so-called solidarity tax on personal income taxes going forward. But the Minister of Finance decided not to do it, not yet anyway, which was the right thing to do. There was a large increase in this various sin taxes. The sin taxes are typically things like taxes on cigarettes and tobacco and so on. I'm going to make a comment about that just now. That was pretty much expected, but again, that's a relatively small portion of total tax stake. The fuel levy increased by 26 cents a litre. I would have increased that by much more if I was the Minister of Finance. It is a broad-based tax. It's an indirect tax. It's relatively easy to collect. It's relatively cheap to collect. So many reasons why. Like I've mentioned, the corporate income taxes, the Minister did announce he would like to reduce that by 1% eventually. And then there was a proposal last year for a total tax increase of around about 40 billion rand. Now, that has been canned, which is a good thing. But I'm pretty sure that in next year or the year thereafter, we may see some other significant tax increases in order to balance the budget. And then something very important. Remember, the Minister of Finance every year, like now, would present his budget, the so-called budget for the year. But in October, usually, the Minister of Finance will deliver what is usually called the so-called mini budget. That's a medium-term budget policy statement where he will update his numbers. It's a report back opportunity for the Minister of Finance. And last year, October, the Minister of Finance told us that he's very concerned about tax revenue, and the tax revenue could be in the region of more than 300 billion rand less than the original budgeted estimates. Now, he revised that now, and he said, no, tax revenue is actually doing not too badly. We are still going to get less, but only 200 billion less. I had a look at the numbers, and I'm not so optimistic as the Minister of Finance. I think that actual tax under collections could quite easily be about 300 billion or even more less than what the Minister of Finance expected in his speech yesterday. Remember, the financial year ends the end of March, and it starts on an appropriate date, the 1st of April, and we still have 2 or 3 months information before we get all the information for the current financial year. But by then, usually people have forgotten about the current financial year and only looking at the next financial year. And I'm concerned that the Minister of Finance may actually find himself to be a little bit out of pocket because of a stronger undercollection in tax revenue in the current financial year. Just remember that. All right. A few comments about the sin taxes. We've had a substantial increase in the various sin taxes. I'm concerned about that. I don't know about you guys, but during the lockdown, everybody could get cigarettes. You can get your Johnny Walker or whatever you wanted to have. So clearly, the illegal or the underground economy was quite active during that time. And by increasing these various sin taxes, the Minister of Finance is making it simply more attractive, more profitable to be part of the so-called underground economy. And I think that was perhaps the wrong thing to do to increase the so-called sin taxes by that much. Anyway, I've got a bit of a moral issue with so-called sin taxes. I believe don't use taxes to get people to do stuff or not to do stuff. Leave that to the individual. And if the politicians are trying to increase the price of cigarettes or alcohol because they want me to smoke less or drink less, I don't think that's their place. Nothing to do with politicians. What I do with my lungs or to my liver, it's my business, and I should have the right to decide whether I want to smoke or drink or not. All right, now this is some interesting calculations that I've done yesterday. Let me go through this. On the left-hand side, remember, personal income tax is by far the most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance. And on the left-hand side, I have the most important, the number of personal income taxpayers in South Africa. So the number of personal income taxpayers in South Africa, registered personal income taxpayers in South Africa are 14 million. Before I go on, Mickey, Professor, can I just ask you if everything is still fine? Can you still hear me fine? All of that, everything going fine?
Everything going well. Thank you, Darby. Please continue.
Cool. All right. Okay, so let's have a look on the left-hand side. That bar on the left-hand side, there are 14 million registered personal income taxpayers in South Africa. Now that 50%, 51%, that blue block over there, they don't pay personal income tax whatsoever because their income falls below the threshold. And then the guys, the red block upwards, those are the guys actually paying personal income taxes. Now, if you look on top, there's a little thin blue line on top there. Now that is 13,000 individuals. 13,000 individuals, that's less than 1%. 13,000 individuals in South Africa is responsible for 27% of total personal income taxes. Now, if you look at the top 2 million, personal income payers over there, they are responsible for more than 80% of the total personal income tax stake. The point I want to make, and I made a comment earlier, South Africa's tax system, it doesn't make sense to look at one tax only. You have to look at the total tax regime. But the tax regime in South Africa is hugely what we call progressive, which simply means relatively few people pay most of these taxes. Personal income tax is the most important tax, and personal income tax, you can see, is that there are very, very few individuals paying just about all the personal income taxes. Okay, this is personal income taxes. The next one is even more shocking. The next one is corporate taxes, and that's company taxes. Now, there are in total 700 odd companies registered in South Africa, less than 1 million. And of that, look on top there. There's a very, very thin red line on top there. You probably can't even see that. Now those are 763, not 763,000, 763 companies. Less than 1,000 companies in South Africa is responsible for more than 60% of the total corporate income taxes. Let that sink in for a moment. We are dependent on less than 1,000 companies for more than 2/3 of total corporate taxes in South Africa. Basically, one can say, except for 1,000 companies, we don't have company taxes in South Africa. We are so dependent on a few profitable companies for just about all the corporate income in South Africa. And we have to make life very easy for those guys and very attractive for those guys to stay in South Africa and keep on paying in South Africa, because we are very, very dependent on them for their taxes. All right, so a few other issues. The Minister of Finance didn't mention anything about the wealth tax. I don't think we're going to have a wealth tax in South Africa. Well, maybe in future sometime. Some analysts and some, let's call them left-wing economists, are suggesting that we have to introduce a wealth tax in order to reduce inequality in South Africa. That's part of the reason. That's a completely different debate. We're not going to do much about inequality if we introduce a wealth tax. I think it's not a very clever idea, a wealth tax, but anyway, I don't think it will happen in South Africa. It's quite difficult to do that. It's quite expensive. The Minister of Finance previously mentioned some relaxation on the so-called loop structures. That has to do with international investments, which is a good thing. People are very aggressively restructuring the tax affairs to get away from these high levels of tax, and they make use of quite often some loop structures internationally as well. There was a new tax on scrap implemented, scrap metal. Of course, thank you to Minister Patel. And like I've mentioned earlier, be very careful not to be too optimistic on your revenue expectations. Revenue may in fact come in below your adjusted estimates of revenue. Okay, that's the revenue side. Let's have a look at the expense or the expenditure announcements by the Minister of Finance. Again, the normal old graph, state spending. Remember, the Minister of Finance is planning to cut back on the rate of increase of state spending over the next couple of years. But it takes a long time to turn this oil tanker around, and we're going to see, relative to GDP, a further increase in state spending over the next couple of years. And only after 2 or 3 years will we see a bit of a dip in state spending relative to GDP. Unfortunately, in the meantime, debt levels will keep on going up, and the taxes are simply just not there. But let's just analyze a little bit where the money goes to. The most important expense item for the Minister of Finance, that 400 billion there, goes to education, and a couple of other ones, social protection, health services, and so on. This excludes interest on state debt. Interest on state debt is currently around about 20% of total state spending, and within 2 years or so, interest on state debt will be the biggest expense item for the Minister of Finance, even larger than education. Maybe just a comment about education. We spend more on education than most countries in the world. The quality of our education is not only bad, quite often it is the worst in the world. So education, and I believe that education is very, very important for us in South Africa. I think we need to spend, we have to do much better with the money that we get in terms of education, because that's the future of South Africa. And especially if we want to participate and be part of the modern so-called fourth industrial revolution economy, we have to make sure that we properly train our kids. And it starts at primary education. Primary education, without a doubt, is by far the most important level of education. What you're going to learn in grade 1 is multiples of what you're going to learn in terms of your increase of the knowledge that you're going to gather will be multiples of than what you're going to learn in your final year in your PhD in chemical engineering. Grade 1, without a doubt, is by far the most important year. Okay, well, I'm digressing. All right, some other announcements. that the minister made in terms of expenditure. Grants increases that he's planning to give over the next couple of years are well below inflation. Well below inflation. I feel very sorry, especially for people that are very dependent on these grants, but I'm afraid the grants increases over the next couple of years are going to be well below inflation. And the reason for that is simply because we do not have money. Keep in mind that we've used the unemployment insurance fund the last year. More than 100 billion was used, and that was used to support people because of the lockdown. But the unemployment insurance fund is running a deficit now of about 20 billion rand. The minister cut the grants to the municipalities, especially the municipalities that get money but don't spend it on infrastructure. It is a good thing. Our municipalities, many of our municipalities are mismanaged, and it's a good thing that the municipalities that provides them with all this capital is closed a little bit. The municipalities must be run much better than what we're currently getting. And then, of course, the real controversial part is that the Minister of Finance announced a well below inflation increase to the civil servants over the next couple of years, which is a good thing. That the South African civil servants are hugely overpaid and in most instances hugely underworked. Of course, there are many civil servants that are overworked and underpaid without a doubt, but I've done some calculation comparing civil servants to the private sector equivalents, comparing our civil servants to some international civil servants, as their pay. It's just our civil servants are paid too much. We simply cannot afford it anymore. And do you know there are more than 35,000 civil servants in South Africa that are paid more than R1 million annually? Note, I don't use the word earn, I use the word pay. Earn is a matter of opinion, paid is a matter of fact. So the Minister of Finance is planning to cut, which of course isn't a cut, it's a slower increase in the wage bill. Kusatu already indicated they're not very happy about that, but it's inevitable, people. We've had far too much wage increases, or far too strong wage increases the last couple of years. We simply cannot afford this anymore, and this is going to be the real politically difficult thing for the Minister for Finance to do. Will he stick to his guns? Will he be allowed to do this? Because without a significant smaller increase in the wage bill, we are going to be in very deep trouble. The grants, currently there are approximately 18 million people receiving grants in South Africa. Comparing that to the number of people with jobs in South Africa, about 15 million. Remember, there was 16 million people receiving grants with jobs in South Africa. And we are going to see another increase in the number of people depending on these grants over the next couple of years. Maybe just a comment. A good social protection system is one with fewer people, not more people. This a huge number of people that are dependent on the taxpayer has become unsustainable. And remember, you also have to add about 2 million civil servants to this. So we have about 20 million people that are dependent on approximately 16 million people. And of that 16 million people, 2 million of them are civil servants. Some other expenditure announcement, the Minister of Finance made some comments about the loan scheme, the 200 billion that the banks are supposed to be lending out. They are far too high. Maybe the money to smaller businesses particularly. That's going to be a little bit difficult to do. And of course, especially is going to include some other financial institutions on that specific scheme as well. Nothing on the national health insurance. We cannot afford that in any event. So I don't think the national health insurance is going to happen. If ever, it's only going to happen in many years' time. And looking at the efficiency of the state, hopefully it is not going to happen soon. The national health insurance, many politicians did say that the pandemic is the reason why we actually have to accelerate the implementation of the NHI. I don't think that's a valid reason. We need to fix the quality of our existing health system before we can talk about the national health insurance. Okay, that's it on the spending numbers. So let me have a look on the, I'm running out of time, on some of the debt numbers. Remember the gap between how much they spend and what they get in, that is the fiscal deficit, and this is the fiscal deficit. This is the so-called consolidated or the main budget deficit. Don't worry too much about the terminology, but essentially what it means is that the fiscal deficit is by far the biggest fiscal deficit ever in the history of South Africa. and it will be with us for a very long period of time. And in the process, state debt levels will keep on going up. I've got various ministers of finance here. And if I want to point a finger to somebody that played a significant and important role over the last couple of years and should take some of the responsibility for this massive increase in state debt, it must be Pravin Gordhan. I know he's a darling of the business community, but Pravin Gordhan was overseeing state finances when things started going wrong, when the wheels started coming off. And now we have Tito Mboweni, the poor guy, that is trying to fix the mess which he inherited. But that's fiscal debt to GDP. I think it is going to be much higher than what the Minister of Finance is planning there. Then some downgrades. I think there's a possibility of the downgrade. Moody's already indicated that they're going to downgrade us even further. Will we default? No, we will not default. We have enough forex exchange at the South African Reserve Bank to pay off our foreign loans, so that's not an issue. And countries do not default on their own local denominated currency debt. So we can simply, in crude terms, print money to pay off our debt. Of course, that will lead to inflation, but we will not default. So I'm not concerned about the possible default. Some other things. The Minister of Finance mentioned the zero-based budget, which is a good thing. I'm not going to go through everything else. He one or two technical things. He mentioned that the 12J scheme will be cancelled. If there are any questions on that, I'll take that a little bit later on. And he did mention legislation is on its way to make it easier for pension funds to invest in infrastructure. The only thing to be concerned there is that eventually prescribed assets may become a reality in South Africa. Not yet, but it may become a reality eventually. Eskom question was not really addressed by the Minister of Finance. Remember, Eskom owes something like 500 billion rand. Eskom is totally and completely unsustainable. We have to make some sort of plan with Eskom, and they're simply kicking that can down the road. Some of the other state-owned enterprises, some of them are getting some more money, but we've known about this all along, South African Airways and the Land Bank. But I do think there's a very good possibility that some of these state-owned enterprises, like the NEL, may be liquidated within the next couple of months, which is a good thing. I believe they should be liquidated, they should be privatized because they've been mismanaged anyway for many, many years. Maybe one or two other comments. I'm going to skip that one. I just want to get to things, something that I think we need to be all concerned about. There's a report by the International Monetary Fund. It's about not only South Africa, but it's about the world, the globe. And they're concerned about disruptions and unrest because people are losing jobs, poverty is going up, unemployment is going up, and especially in South Africa, I'm concerned about this. We've got very high levels of unemployment and poverty, and we see a smaller increase in the planned increase for the wages on the civil servants, and I'm concerned about social disruption and unrest in South Africa over the next couple of years. That's something that we have to be aware of. Maybe just one or two final comments. South Africa is a country with amazing, real amazing opportunities. Unfortunately, I think South African economy, in terms of the quality of our leadership, the policies have been wrong in many instances. There was a mismanagement of the fiscal accounts for many years, and to a large extent still pushing us literally to the edge. And under these sort of circumstances, we need very, very strong political leadership. And sometimes I wonder if our political leadership is up to all these various challenges. I'm an asset manager. So what I do, I take people's money and I manage it. I put it in various structures. I put it in portfolios and I balance the portfolios and so on. So this is from an asset management point of view, one or two takeaways. I'm quite bullish, despite the issues that we have in the fiscal accounts. I'm actually quite bullish on our local bonds. Our local bonds are very attractive in terms of yields. Internationally, you get nothing or sometimes below zero yields. South Africa, you can get yields of nearly 9% or so. So that's very attractive. Secondly, our financial markets are very, very liquid, which is very, very important. And our currency is relatively cheap, making it very attractive for foreigners to invest in South Africa. Also making it quite volatile, by the way. But I'm actually quite bullish on the local bond market in the short term. Longer term is something else, but in the short term. Local equities, I also like local equities. The local equities are still quite cheap, and for pretty much the same reasons as the bond markets, I'm also quite bullish on the local equities. International bonds, I certainly do not want to own any international bonds. I don't want to get a negative return. So international bonds, I'm underweight, without a doubt, in international equities in the short term at least. I'm certainly very much overweight because of the huge stimulation that we're getting from the fiscal and monetary accounts or authorities internationally. And then on a personal point of view, of course, there are many opportunities in South Africa, depending on each various, our personal financial circumstances differ from individual to individual, but I would advise people to make sure that a substantial portion of your assets are invested abroad. Thank you very much. That is my 45 minutes, slightly over 40, I think exactly right, in 45 minutes. So thank you very much for listening to me. I will be more than happy to take any questions. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. There you are. And I see there are a couple of questions in the chat box, but I'm going to leave that to Mickey. Mickey, if there are specific questions that you would like me to address. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Darby. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Michalis Kastomeris, a very Greek name, but you're welcome to address me as Mickey. And thank you again, Darby, for that fascinating presentation. Now we have an opportunity for some questions and answers. A reminder that there's two ways that you can do this. The first way is you can type in your question into the Q&A facility. Click on the button and type in your question. We already have a few. And the second way that you can do this is that you can raise your hand on Zoom, and then I can call on you to present your question to Darby. So just a reminder, those two ways. And I'm an economist at the Graduate School of Business and Leadership. I lecture economics for management to the MBA students. So thank you, Darby. This is extremely relevant, what you've shared with us today for my MBA class. And I hope many of my students are listening in. And those who are not, I'm planning that they need to rewatch this video. So without any further ado, I already have some questions. And perhaps I can just phrase two of the questions to you now. We received two questions from Yunus Essa. And his first question has to do with exchange rates and the way forward. What do you forecast for exchange rates in the near future? And the second question is to do with interest rates. I know you already spoke to us about that in your presentation, but perhaps you want to just share with us about those two perspectives. Thank you, Darby.
Yeah, thank you, Mickey. Well, I've been trying to forecast the exchange rate for many decades, and I can tell you I can't get it right. So it's extremely difficult to forecast the exchange rate. So what we do, and I've shared that specific graph with you. So remember, the South African inflation rate is usually roughly about 5% higher than that of the United States. And theoretically, at least, and that's why it's important to go to university and to go and listen to what the Mickey's got to say about the economy, to understand the theory at least, because theoretically, if there's a gap in the inflation rate, that is theoretically also the gap at which your currency is supposed, theoretically, to depreciate against another currency. So inflation rate is usually over time roughly about 5% higher than that of the Americans, and that's what I pencil in. So that is, I expect the rand to depreciate by, say, 5% or so. But there are many other variables that affect the short-term exchange rate as well, or short-term movement in exchange rates as well. Things like, for example, in interest rates differentials. So if interest rates are higher in South Africa than the United States, South Africa is more attractive and then leads to capital flowing in. But you know, in the end, South African currency, the rand, is an exceptionally traded currency. It's a currency of the smaller currencies that is probably the most liquid, or one of the most liquid currencies in the world. And in a way, the South African currency is a barometer of international risk in a way. And you can see if nothing happens internationally, or if there's some good news internationally, the rand quite often appreciates because of our very liquid markets and so on. And if there's bad news, even if it's not bad news from South Africa, even if it's some bad news coming from anywhere else in the world, the rand depreciates because everybody runs to where they feel safe, and that's usually the US dollar. Okay, having said all of that, so where's the currency going to go to? I am pretty sure that the rand's going to go weaker. In the short term, I just don't know. But on a medium, longer term, theoretically, and also from my experience, the rand will keep on going weaker against the US dollar, and I expect the rand to continue to depreciate over time. In the short term, anything can happen. That, of course, got a huge impact on our inflation rate. Inflation is quite often, remember, inflation is a process. It's never an event. and a sudden weakness in the currency can get the process going, but then you need fuel to keep this fire burning. And the fuel that you need is extra money, and that's what I showed the money supply graph. So currently, there could be some sparks getting this inflation spiral going, but quite often because the money supply growth is quite muted, inflation doesn't take hold. I don't think inflation in the short term is an issue, but I am concerned over the longer term. I'm very concerned about the longer term in inflation. And that simply means that the Reserve Bank is likely to sit on their hands when we talk about monetary policy, interest rates. So those are my answers. I think in the short term, the rand, roughly at these sort of levels, the same for interest rates. But in the medium, longer term, I think the rand's going to come under pressure as always, and it's always going to be very volatile. And eventually, I also believe that inflation will become a problem. But that's in the medium, longer term, not in the short term. Maybe just a side comment about currencies. I believe that we see some fascinating things happening on currencies with this new, I prefer to call it private currencies. People call it private monies. People call it crypto monies and all sort of funny names. I prefer to call it private monies. And I think there's a shift happening, and that some of these private monies may actually start competing with typical fiat money or central bank money going forward.
Thank you, Darby. We have several questions that are on the Q&A chat box. I'm just going to pick a few here and there. Oliver Balcom says the following question: any opinion on listed property, in particular with the shift to working from home and an increase in online shopping?
Yeah, excellent one. If you ask me what I think about property, I don't like property. I know if there are a couple of property people in here, they're not probably going to like me for saying this, but the reason why I don't like property are the following. Let me tell you why I like property. Property is a good investment because property usually keeps track with inflation. Property is a good investment because you can quite often gear against property. You can borrow against property. But apart from that, property, the geyser will break, and you have to maintain that. It's difficult to collect your rent quite often. It's very illiquid property. The transaction costs are very high. So a physical property, it's not, I don't really like that as an investment. There are some people that are quite good at that. I mean, if you're a developer or a builder or whatever, to have a property, to be a property owner, it can fit into your specific portfolio. But if you want to invest in property, rather invest in listed property because it's much more liquid, the transaction costs are much lower, and so on. So property is good provided it is listed property, generally speaking. Well, of course, depending on what kind of listed property. Obviously, retail listed property has taken a huge knock recently. I think it will remain under pressure. We're still waiting to see what the fallout of this work from home thing, what it's going to look like. But not only that, internet trading is all the rage nowadays. Everybody's buying from Takealot and from Amazon.com and all that. And that's going to change the world, especially for retail property. Some other changes is happening as well. If you look at, for example, at more commercial property, offices, obviously, office blocks. I'm looking at my own office. We're not going to the office anymore. So there will be changes as well. And maybe going back to retail property, I think the nature of retail property could change. People will go to the malls, not to buy stuff anymore, but go to the malls for relaxation, for you go to the restaurants perhaps, or some other relaxation events that you can get from a mall, and not necessarily to buy stuff. But office blocks, those guys are in trouble. And maybe also, if you look at other kinds of commercial property, like, for example, factories. Remember, there's another technological change taking place, and that is, well, apart from artificial intelligence and robots and stuff like that, it is 3D printing. 3D printing will make it easier for people to literally start a little factory in your back garden or in your garage or whatever. And that may, over time, have a significant impact on the way that we manufacture stuff. And in a way, we're going back to our roots. Remember, not that long ago, 200 years ago, most of us worked from home. Most of us worked on farms. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, and we all moved to the offices, to cities, and to offices, and to factories in cities. And that trend is reversing. People moving back to their houses, and they perhaps even moving back to doing their stuff in their garages or whatever. So there's a revolution happening as far as that is concerned. And that will be, we can see that in the prices of the various properties. So I don't know what it's going to look like in future, but what I'm very sure about, property and the way that we utilize property is going to look completely different from what we've become accustomed to.
Thank you, Darby. I'll pick up on two questions here. One is by Sibia, and they ask, what is your reasoning for proposing an even higher fuel levy? I'll just cut that short. There's a more context to that, but what is your reasoning for proposing an even higher fuel levy? And the other question we can maybe pick up on is about the corporate income tax. What is the reason that the dynamic of 0.1% contributing to more than 60% of revenues? Why are they doing that? Why is it structured that way? Thank you.
Why is that so? Yeah, okay, well, this is a long answer to that. Let me try to give you the short answer. Remember, like, it's very important that you have to look at the total tax regime when you make comments like, for example, it's progressive or regressive or whatever the case may be. And like I've already indicated, the South African tax regime is exceptionally progressive, very, very progressive. I am against taxes. All tax increases are always bad. Some tax increases are a little bit less bad than other tax increases. So what I would like to see is an increase in the fuel levy for reasons that I've mentioned already, and a reduction in some other taxes, particularly on company taxes. So I would like to see lower company taxes. All right, and then the question about company tax, so that's why I want a higher fuel levy, because of it's easy and so on, it's relatively cheap, and lower company taxes because a lower company tax will make South Africa more attractive and leading to more investments in South Africa and stronger economic growth. That's part of the reason. And then why is it that relatively few companies pay just about all the company taxes? Remember, companies can. I'm a director of a company. I've been a director of a list for many, many, many years. And companies, because of the nature of companies, you can manage your tax affairs much better than what an individual can manage its tax affairs. And that's what companies do. And companies also, they've got the luxury of writing down things like, for example, capital investments and so on. And in the process, they manage their taxes as much as they possibly can, completely and totally legally. And the result of that is that companies then pay relatively little tax. In South Africa, not only in South Africa, worldwide, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And since companies always shift their tax burden down to individuals, I certainly would propose, so that's another argument, that we cut company taxes as much as we possibly can. Another reason why few companies pay just about all the company taxes in South Africa is that so the South African economy is pretty much dominated by a few very large companies. Just go to the JSE and you will see there are a few very big companies in South Africa, and those are the very profitable companies as well. And on the JSE, as an example, 70% of all revenue on the JSE is actually generated abroad, not even in South Africa. And they are those very, very profitable international companies, South African international companies, and they pay a large chunk of their taxes, of course, in South Africa as well. So what I would like to see, and I agree, I think the underlying question here is that there are too few big companies. So what can we do to have more companies in South Africa? And I agree with that sentiment. And what we need to do is to do things like to lower the tax burden, to lower the labor burden, because that's quite expensive, to lower the burden in the form of various red tape requirements, to make it really easy for businesses to do business in South Africa. It's difficult to run a small business in South Africa. It's very expensive. It's much easier running a big business, because in our business, we appoint people to fill in forms because there are all sort of requirements. We appoint compliance officers, but the small company can't do that. It's expensive. So those are the kind of obstacles in a way for smaller businesses. And that's part of the reason why we have these there's huge companies. And that's also the reason why we have huge companies paying the bulk of the taxes.
Thank you, Darby. Another question here from Christopher Holton is, are there stats showing how lowering of interest rates affects those who are retired and their spending patterns? Are there effects of a nature creating more people needing social grants due to this?
Yeah, without a doubt. That is a huge problem. I must tell you, intuitively, from my background, I worked at the South African Reserve Bank for many years as well. And whenever you're unsure, if you're a central banker, and whenever you're unsure, keep interest rates high or increase interest rates. I am very much in favor of higher interest rates. Now, I know there are many economists, including you, Professor, that's probably going to disagree with me on that one. And we can debate that, but I've got some reasons why I say that. But to come back to the question, the reality is that interest rates in South Africa, compared to other countries in the world, may be relatively high in nominal terms. But also keep in mind that we have inflation that is also, compared to other countries, relatively high. So in real terms, our interest rates in South Africa is not really that high. But I'm afraid the reality also is that there are many people that, especially the elderly, that are very much dependent on interest income. And central banks all over the world, they usually cut interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. And the people paying the price for that are people that are dependent on interest income. And quite often they are the elderly. And I really do feel sorry for them. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar kind of social security net that many other richer countries got in the world. And I know of many elderly people. I'm an asset manager. I get this every day, that simply cannot survive on this kind of interest that they're currently getting. That's a major problem. People quite often forget that they think if you cut interest rates, it's good for the economy. It may be good if you owe money, but it's certainly not good if you're dependent on interest income.
Thank you, Darby. Another question from Alistair Kenneth, who says, what offshore instruments would you recommend currently? Money in offshore accounts earns almost zero interest. Are equities or fixed-term deposits preferred?
Now, I always go for equity, depending on individual to individual, of course. So depending on your risk profile. But generally speaking, I always go for equities. I prefer equities. Equities are very much more volatile, therefore much more riskier. But equities, if you're a good asset manager, equities is the place to be. Equities over time will give you a better return. More important, however, if you want to move offshore, it is very important, people, let me sort of repeat this. It is very important to make sure you have the correct structures. People quite often put their money in the wrong structures and you end up paying a lot of taxes. Estate duties could be very high internationally, or you may be even losing your money for various reasons. So make sure you talk to people that understand these international structures, and make sure you put the money in the correct structures before you even think about what instruments to put. Structures are very important. Make sure about it.
Thank you. Sibia says, regards 12J cancellation. What is the alternative on the lost investments to these listed startup companies?
Yeah, well, to answer that one, and again, this is a sort of a philosophical answer. Let me start off with a bit of a philosophical answer.
Sorry,
yes.
Darby, just to help our audience, perhaps you can explain briefly what is 12J. Thank you.
All right, I will. Let me just give a sort of a starting point. One of the requirements for a good tax system. A good tax system, one of the requirements is that a good tax system is neutral. The requirement of neutrality. What does that mean? It means you shouldn't use your tax system to encourage people to do things or to discourage people to do things. Now, a good example is the so-called sin taxes, where politicians use sin taxes to discourage people from smoking and drinking. So theoretically or philosophically, that is not a good thing to do because we want tax neutrality. Now, that's exactly what the so-called 12J investments is as well. 12J investments allows you to invest in certain projects and to get the tax benefit from doing that. Now, that hasn't been that successful. Only about 5 billion or so has been invested the last couple of years in that. And the Minister of Finance decided now to can that and not to continue with that. Obviously, it's costing him tax revenue. So from a philosophical point of view, I agree with that, because don't use your tax system to encourage or discourage people to do stuff. And the reason why people don't invest enough in South Africa is not because they don't get encouragement, it's because of other reasons. Because the tax burden, generally speaking, is just too high, or because of the other reasons that I've mentioned. But the Minister of Finance has decided now not to continue with the 12J. So the tax benefits that you got in the past from investing in certain projects, that has been cancelled, and you won't.
Thank you, Darby. Christopher Holton asks, how is the Africa Free Trade Agreement going to affect tax revenues?
Not much, and not at first, at least. Maybe I can just a side comment. You know, South Africa, there's something called the Customs Union Agreement in South Africa, and South Africa and a couple of countries around us belong to this, and we pay many billions of rands to our neighbors because of this specific agreement. But now, yes, the new free trade agreement has just become effective in Africa from the 1st of January this year. And quite ironically, it's the same day on which we closed our borders, the 1st of January. So what is supposed to happen is that the African economy should integrate more with one another. It's a brilliant, wonderful idea. We really, as Africans, we're here to push that. We have to integrate our financial systems. We have to integrate our companies and trade and all that. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure it's going to be a huge success, at least in the short term, for various reasons. Politics is certainly one of those. And because South Africa simply doesn't trade that much with the rest of Africa, I don't think it's going to have much of an impact on tax collections, at least not in the short term. But it's a good idea, and but I'm afraid we politicians and politics is probably going to stand in the way of proper integration of African economies, at least in the short term.
Thanks, Darby. Ronald Pillay asks, how does labor reform policies come into the equation to address economic stimulation? And he continues to clarify, I'm speaking about the equity aspects as well as the fact that it is resulting in a huge brain drain in our nation.
Sure, that's a long. Okay, we are losing a lot of very important. Let me start again. I've done some calculations. Like I've said, I've given you a breakdown of the fiscal accounts, and I've actually calculated. In fact, I've got an article in today's newspaper, if you want to go and read that, about the redistribution effect of the fiscus in South Africa, which simply means the guys paying the money are not the guys getting the benefit. And that redistribution effect is massive. It's very, very big. And if we lose one guy that earns R1 million per year, we lose a lot of money. So a guy that emigrates earning R1 million or more per year, we are losing a lot of tax on that. And we have to make life easier for those guys because we need them. We need the tax. And we need also some of their other talents. They create jobs and they create wealth and all that. So we're losing a lot of entrepreneurs. At the same time, we've got a huge gap in between the haves and the have-nots in South Africa. So how can we address that? And there are various ways of addressing it, and the politicians are trying to address that. Unfortunately, they're following the wrong approach mostly. They're following the approach by taxing those rich people more, thinking they're going to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But that's not the main reason why we have a huge disparity between the have and the have-nots in South Africa. The most important reason has to do with the fact that some people's got jobs and other people not. That's the main reason for inequality in South Africa. Some other reasons as well, but that is the main reason. And the only way that we can reduce this inequality, or I don't care about inequality. I care about the poor more. And the only way we can get the poor to be better off is to get this economy to grow. And counterintuitively, you're going to get the poor will be better off not by increasing the minimum wage, as an example, but by lowering the minimum wage, encouraging more people to employ more people. More companies to employ more people, and that's going to reduce unemployment. Unfortunately, again, politicians got it completely wrong. You think you have to tax the rich more. You think you have to implement all sort of legislation to get to somehow try to empower the poor. But the best form of empowerment and the best way to get a good job, by the way, the best way of getting a good job is to get a job first. Then you're going to get a good job thereafter.
Thank you, Darby. A question from Nkolisi Kota says, what should be the role of development finance institutions, such as the IDC, etc., in stimulating recovery and economic growth in the current environment?
Yes, again, I'm a little bit of an ideological animal, I admit. I believe that the state should play a small role as possible in these sort of things. The reason why I say so, I'm in finance. I'm a director of a company, of a number of companies. We are doing all sort of corporate transactions all the time. We've just done a huge corporate transaction. And in fact, we're busy with a large one at the moment. And I can promise you, I know because I've been involved in this. If you bring a deal to invest, if there's a good deal out there, there's more than enough money for investors that would like to invest in that. So we don't actually need institutions like the IDC and so on. And in fact, many of these institutions have been mismanaged the last couple of years. We all know that. So there's no lack of money. There's more than enough money out there. You just have to bring a good deal to potential investors, local and international. There's more than enough money. All you have to do is to bring a good deal. And in order to be able to identify those good deals and to create more deals, we need a growing economy. We need a liberalized economy to be able to create all these deals. The money is to worry.
Thanks, Darby. The internet connection was a little bit broken there. It says it's unstable, but we're still hearing you. Another question from Christopher Holton is, he says, is there going to be a continuation of the small business corporation taxes? This is a huge boon to small companies within the definition of small business corporations. Many do not utilize this as it is a great option for startups. Will there be a continuation of the small business corporation taxes?
Yeah, I think the question here is, will there be a continuation in the support for smaller businesses generally? I think that is certainly one of the aims of government, to make it easier for smaller businesses. Unfortunately, the government is not very efficient and effective in these sort of things. And I think many smaller businesses are not aware of all the different projects that are out there to support the smaller businesses. And again, I'm not very much in favor of this. I'm far more in favor of things like, for example, making it easier to do business in the country. That will create a lot of opportunities in itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Darby. We have a comment here, well, a question asking for your comment from Mimi Indokweni. She says, a comment please on pension system collapsing because of debt.
Yeah. Okay. I think the question is, remember, the state needs a lot of money. They've been borrowing a lot of money, like I've showed to you. I've showed you some of the numbers on state borrowing. The state accounts have become completely unsustainable. So will we eventually see the state dipping in the savings of the pension funds? And already pension funds fund the state. A large chunk of the state's funding requirement is funded by pension funds in South Africa. Are we going to, in future, going to see some sort of forced funding for the state from pension funds? And it's really touch and go. It could happen. I am getting more and more concerned about that. That's not officially on the table yet, but I'm getting more concerned about that. What I would like to do is rather making it easier for pension funds to invest abroad and to diversify their own portfolios by being allowed to invest more abroad and giving more freedom to the trustees of pension funds. But you're right. I think your question, what you're hinting at, is that there could be some form of prescribed assets going forward for pension funds, which of course will be to the detriment of pensioners, people, members of the pension funds. It's not there yet, but I'm worried about something like that going forward, yes.
Yes, thanks, Darby. Darby, we have a verbal question here. Sean Rogers, could you please pose your question to us? Thank you. And if Shakila could please open up his mic so Sean Rogers can pose his question. I see his hand is raised. Thank you.
He is unmuted. Sean, you can continue.
It still shows muted on my side.
Yeah.
Shakila, he's still muted. Thanks.
He's muted on his side. He needs to unmute himself. I'm asking him to.
Thank you, Sean Rogers. Open up your mic. Meanwhile, while we're getting that sorted, I'll go to the next question. And Mandy Russell says, in your final part of your presentation, what is your definition of short term? What is short term in your view?
Yeah, I'm always scared of that question. Short term, in my view, is literally a couple of months or maybe less short term. Economists doing some economic estimates like inflation and money supply and that sort of stuff. It's relatively easy for the next couple of months for various reasons. One is simply that in many cases, some of these economic aggregates are simply a percentage change year on year. So at least I know half the equation. I know what's going on this month. So all I need to figure out is what's going to happen in a 1 year's time. So half the equation is known already. Further than that, further than 1 year makes life much more difficult. So let's say medium term is longer than a year, and then going up for even as much as 5 years, and then long term is perhaps say 3 years or 5 years and longer.
Thank you, Darby. We have another question from Christopher Holton. And he says, where are we in the legislation regarding IP valuations given the Internet of Things and the industrial Internet of Things? This must be a huge loophole of where it is based, used and what value it creates?
Must I answer that question, because that's a bit of a trade secret?
Well, I don't know. You feel free to answer as you like.
Yeah, no.
But,
Let me. I've heard of rumors. I've heard certain rumors of people, for example, they've got a patent or some IP value, and they in South Africa or abroad, and you can sell this IP to South Africans, or South Africans can sell it to people abroad, and you can get shares in equities, as an example, or companies as an exchange for payment for this. And quite often the valuation of these assets, intangible assets, are very, very difficult to do. So I think what I'm trying to get to is that this is a really very difficult for tax collectors internationally, because they don't know how to value these sort of things. And people, I've heard, sometimes quite aggressively use over or undervaluation of these sort of assets in order to manage their tax affairs. Now, I try to answer that as diplomatically as I possibly could.
Thank you. One more question here from Christopher Holton. He's giving us lots of questions. Thank you. But he says, the cut in the public services salaries by 265 billion, does this include the so-called suspension payments? Are they not the quick wins by getting the disciplinaries, etc., finalized faster so that the costs can be cut? If this was private sector, the HR department would have been replaced by now for not closing these down, he says.
Yeah, you're completely right. In fact, there are a couple other things proposed by the minister. Certain bonuses are being cut and certain other benefits are being cut as well. But remember, Christopher, just the point is that you're referring to the cut of 265 billion in salaries. There's no cut. There's certainly no cut. It's just a plan to spend less than what they originally planned to spend. But you're right. I think they can be much, much more aggressive. If this was a private sector company, then your shareholders would have fired the HR department long ago.
A question from Kevin says, is crypto, it's slightly off topic, I suppose, but is crypto going to change their reliance on traditional economic measurements like balance of payments, etc.?
Yeah, this is no, don't let me start on cryptos. I'm private money. And again, be careful. It's the underlying technology that's important. But this technology allow individuals to hide your identity. Which means that the moment you buy a so-called cryptocurrency, basically you internationalize. Also, you basically internationalize your assets. I mean, if you buy Bitcoin in South Africa, you can spend your Bitcoin anywhere in the world. That means that foreign exchange regulations become irrelevant. That's got some certain implications for things also, like, for example, tax collections. So yes, I think this technology is going to disrupt finance. It's going to disrupt tax collections. It's going to disrupt banking. It's going to be hugely disruptive, and it may even undermine this thing that we call a sovereign entity called a country. It may even affect that as well. So yes, I'm very excited about the future of our cryptos, but because it's going to, I don't even understand all the implications, but what I do know and understand is going to be hugely disruptive. Maybe I can also add is that I did make the comment earlier, is that the world economy is probably bigger than what we think, and the local economy also probably bigger than what we think. And I think this so-called cryptocurrencies is part of that. There's a lot of economic activity going on there that we're simply not aware of and should theoretically be added to calculating gross domestic product, as an example. So yes, this is disruption. That's all I'm sure about.
And then perhaps a last question from Christopher Holton before we end the session is that, what are the movements towards capturing the undocumented economy, cash, transport, etc., the undocumented economy? Has there been research done in possible revenues this could produce, and such research directing a future strategies to bring this into the net, the revenues?
Yeah.
Into the net? Yeah,
that's the so-called informal economy. And there are a lot of research being done on that. My view is that the informal economy in South Africa is at least 10% of the South African economy. And the one way of taxing them, and that's another reason why I'm in favor of indirect taxes like the fuel tax, is because by increasing the fuel tax, you also capture that part of the economy. Is it a good thing to be all those tax evaders, tax dodgers. If we get them into the tax net, is that a good thing? Because people say that if everybody pays their part, then everybody's going to pay less. That's not the case. If everybody pays their part, the politician's simply going to spend more. So don't think for one moment you're going to pay less if we get the other tax dodgers into the tax net as well. But certainly, the Minister of Finance did indicate that they try, and that's a continuous process. They're trying to get all these people that are not tax compliant into the tax net and see if they can increase the tax take because of that, but don't necessarily think it's a good thing, and it's certainly not going to benefit those that are compliant.
Thank you, Darby Root, and to our attendees and panelists, thank you so much for your participation. Some really stimulating questions coming through there and some interesting answers. Thanks, Darby. Darby Root is the Director and Chief Economist at the Efficient Group. Darby, thank you so much for an efficient presentation. My students are definitely going to benefit from this. I have benefited from your deep insights. And so do you have and of course, just thank you to all those who have helped this session come together. Hazel Langa, Shakila Thakurprasad, Professor Anna Martins, the Dean and Head of School for the Graduate School of Business and Leadership. Thank you for the introduction to Darby's presentation. And this has really been a thought-provoking and insightful presentation from you, Darby. Darby, I look forward to interacting with you going forward, and I'm sure many of the panelists and attendees will be contacting you for some wise counsel and sound advice going forward. Darby, do you have a final comment for us before we end the session going forward?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just maybe make a final comment. And I did indicate that I'm ideologically, let's call it free market orientated, I guess. But please don't look at capitalists like me, and those are horrible people. Economists are out there, and economics is not about, first of all, economics is not about money. Economics is not about financial markets. It's not about interest rates and stuff like that. Economics is about one thing only, and it is about people. And even economists, heartless economists, got really one thing that we all want to achieve, or one thing that we all wish for South Africa, and that is South Africa become prosperous, that we do not have poverty, that we have a wonderful life, all South Africans. And I believe that the best way that we can achieve that is to allow people to take charge of their own lives. And that means I believe in people, and I believe in a free market, and I believe in freedom. And I don't think politicians should tell us what to do. And I don't think politicians should take away these freedoms. Leave it to the individual, and you will be amazed how much energy there is in South Africa. So we certainly have a future in South Africa. I'm very, very concerned about things like, for example, the fiscal accounts and so on. And I'm very, very concerned about politicians continuously undermining individual freedoms. So let's fight against that, and let's believe in freedom. And I believe we've got a wonderful future in South Africa. And the last comment, do not break any laws. Stick to within the law, the letter of the law, but pay as little tax as possible.
Thank you, Darby Root. Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that these webinar series from the Graduate School of Business and Leadership are regular. So please have a look at our Graduate School of Business and Leadership webpage to register for the next webinar that is coming soon. Thank you for your participation, and I hope you have a blessed day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.